Yeah, we can start recording the moment that we start with the lecture. But yeah, King, you are working, I think, with the pluralism project too at Harvard, or not?
Yes, oh, sorry. Was it Chris?
Yeah, I think there was a problem with the micro with Steve. Okay. So Kim, would you like to introduce yourself to Dr. Rambachan and say what you are doing with your graduate program at Harvard?
Hi, yes. Can you guys hear me okay? Because the sound is coming in and out.
I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yes, I'm on my third course. I'm actually working through Harvard's Extension School program, so I'm online. I'm in the, very beginning stages of my master's degree, but my focus is going to be on comparative religions, and I'm kind of tossed between whether I want to go history of religions or philosophy of religion. I seem to be drawn to religious phenomena, metaphysics, things like that, cosmology. Right now, I'm taking a course with Dr. Kimberly Patton, and my
You just went off a little bit on sound there.
So it seems like we are getting more and more people connecting. And what I will recommend, since we want to be in time, thank you to all of you for joining us today. Ian is with us, so he will be he's our president, the president of our club. So I'm pretty sure he will be the one then introducing Dr. Rambachan. And we have the chair of my department and colleagues from different departments who are interested in your topic. So with no further ado, Ian, would you mind to introduce our speaker today and even yourself in terms of what is your officer position in our club?
Hello, my name is Ian. I'm the president of the Philosophy and Religious Studies Club. And today we have the pleasure of having a discussion hosted by Dr. Rambachan, and he'll be teaching us the Gandhi's teachings about Ahimsa and Satyagraha. And without further ado.
Thank you very much. Shall we start then, Chris?
Yeah, I think we should start because some people are going to be joining us later on, but I think we have right now many people already ready to hear what you have to say about Gandhi on these important pillars of philosophy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, greetings, everyone, and let me thank my friend, Professor Chris, and all of you for extending to me this invitation to share a few thoughts about Mahatma Gandhi and his, especially his teachings on nonviolence, Ahimsa, and Satyagraha. So it's a special pleasure and honor for me. I look forward to our conversation. So I'll just present initially, and then we'll open up for your own observations, questions, and we'll have a discussion. The first thing I wanted to say about Gandhi, it may be obvious to all of you, but nevertheless, I think it's important to make this point, especially since in recent times, Gandhi has come under certain kinds of criticism for various reasons. So I do want to open up by saying that Gandhi never claimed perfection or infallibility. He was very deeply aware of his own defects and faults as a human being, but I would say that he worked ceaselessly and very sincerely until the end of his life to become a better human being, and especially for him, a non-violent human being. In fact, he ended his autobiography, and I commend it very highly to you, My Experiments with Truth. This is the title.
You would think that there would be legal ramifications, not budget ramifications. The vice president of the Alachua County Council of PTA says this.
Let me see. Yeah, I think Dr. Vasudha Narayanan, please make sure that you mute. Yes, thank you. Make sure that everyone is muting their phones. Thank you.
Wonderful. So Gandhi ended his autobiography, and I mentioned the title, My Experiments with Truth, with the request for a prayer from his reader that God would bless him with nonviolence in thought, in word, and in action. He lived his life in the public gaze as few leaders have done. And I think there are very few leaders in history who were as transparent about their failings and weaknesses as Gandhi. The title Mahatma, which was given to him by India's Nobel laureate poet Rabindranath Tagore, Mahatma means a great soul, caused him much pain and very little joy. In his autobiography, he quoted the words of a very famous Indian poet to express his feelings about himself. And just 2 lines. Where is there a wretch so wicked and loathsome as I? I have forsaken my maker, so faithless have I been. Having said that, Gandhi is not less relevant to us because of his imperfections. On the contrary, I want to say that his humanity makes him even more relevant to us. I think that those who claim perfection or those who we regard as perfect are not easily accessible as models for us. We learn much more from those who share our human failings, but who strive in humility to become better human beings. Gandhi's grandson, in a recent book about his grandfather, Rajmohan Gandhi, wrote that, and I quote, "The imperfect Gandhi was an astonishing human being." I like that statement very much. The imperfect Gandhi was an astonishing human being. An astonishing human being is an apt description. Gandhi's name is synonymous, as you know very well, with the long struggle for Indian independence. But what many do not know is that he never aspired for or held any political office in India, and did not exercise control or influence on the basis of office or wealth. He was nominated, incidentally, he was nominated 5 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. The final time was before his assassination in 1948. He was clearly one of the most deserving candidates, but there was never a word of complaint for him for the fact that he was overlooked. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the 1964 Nobel Prize winner, acknowledged Gandhi in his acceptance speech. And in 1989, the Dalai Lama, who was the Nobel Prize winner, called his award a tribute, and I quote, to my mentor, Mahatma Gandhi. As we were speaking just before I started my talk with Steve, Gandhi's appeal is a rare one in the history of human leadership. It was clearly, even for those who disagreed with him, an appeal of moral integrity. And I think perhaps nothing testifies to his moral integrity more than his possessions after he died. There is a museum that I highly recommend that you visit in India, the Gandhi Museum, where Gandhi's 5 possessions are displayed. And what were these? A pocket watch, because he was always he was obsessive about punctuality. A pair of a pair of sandals that he made for himself. Third, his spectacles. Fourth, a bowl, a wooden bowl from which he ate his meals. And the fifth is a gift by a Japanese friend, and you probably know these figures, 3 tiny porcelain monkeys who seem to say, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. These are the 5 possessions of Gandhi on this display in the museum. Perhaps one story from his life tells clearly this quality of moral integrity that he possessed and he struggled to deepen throughout his life. As you may know, Gandhi failed when he returned to India after studying law in the United Kingdom. He was not successful as an attorney because he could hardly speak in court. He was congenitally shy, hard to imagine, and was failing at getting employment in the courts of India. So he was invited to South Africa to do some legal work, and he stayed in South Africa for 21 years as an attorney, serving the Indian immigrant community in South Africa. In 1901, when he was about to leave and return to India, the community expressed its gratitude with expensive gifts that included a gold necklace for his wife, Kasturbai, gold chains, gold watches, rings. Gandhi was very agitated about this, and he wrote, in great detail about this temptation in his autobiography. Is it right for a public servant to accept gifts? Many of those who gave gifts were also involved in public service. It was difficult, he confessed. It's a difficult matter for him. And I am quoting now, that evening I was presented with the bulk of these things. I had a sleepless night. I walked up and down my room, deeply agitated, but could find no solution. It was difficult, and he confesses it was difficult for me to forego gifts worth hundreds, but it was more difficult to keep them. I was exhorting people to conquer their infatuation for possessions. What was I to do with the jewelry that had come to me? End of quote. He decided he could not accept these gifts and placed everything in a trust in favor of the community. So this decision, which was not without struggle and temptation, I think testifies to his willingness to embody what he demanded of others. That public service must not be misused for self-enrichment and personal gain. One must become, as the famous quote, one must become the change that one wants to see in the world. So what I'm going to do now is to focus on his teachings on Ahimsa, or non-violence and Satyagraha. The question that my topic is Gandhi's teachings on Ahimsa and Satyagraha. What could we learn? So the question, what could we learn, is one for all of us. I am presenting the teachings. Then I think we should ask ourselves at the end of it, what could we learn? What is there to learn? So first, the word Ahimsa, it's a Sanskrit word. Himsa means injury, or as widely translated, violence. And the is negative Sanskrit prefix. So Ahimsa is non-injury. Gandhi did not invent this term. Ahimsa is a core value. I would say it is the cardinal ethical Hindu value. It's also the most important value in the tradition of Jainism. And I should mention also that Gandhi grew up in the state of Gujarat, in the region of Porbandar, where there was a very strong Jain community. And I think many of his practices, his asceticism, his deep commitment to non-injury, comes also from the Jain tradition. He wrote about Jain monks visiting very regularly into his home. I don't think that there are many traditions in our world that take the practice of non-violence as seriously as Jains, and especially Jain monks do, who are considerate about life in its most minute forms. Ahimsa is always listed in ethical lists in the Hindu tradition, in texts like Yoga Shastras, in the Bhagavad Gita, and other texts. Ahimsa is always the first in any list of cardinal ethical values. In fact, Ahimsa precedes even truth as an ethical value in the Hindu tradition. Before Gandhi, however, I would say that Ahimsa was largely understood as an ethical value relevant for individual transformation, or relevant in an individual relational concern, limited to the sphere of individual personal relationships. So this is where I think Gandhi was novel and he was creative. And this is something that Dr. Martin Luther King praised him or commended him for. He understood Gandhi's contribution. And in his autobiography, he gave one of the highest tributes to Gandhi. This is what Dr. King wrote. Gandhi was probably the first person in history. Gandhi was probably the first person in history to lift the love ethic of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective social force on a large scale. Love for Gandhi was a potent instrument for social and collective transformation. End of quote. I think it's a very astute observation of Dr. Martin Luther King, who, as you know, regarded himself as a disciple of Gandhi. It was Gandhi's genius, as Dr. King so rightly described, to interpret and transform nonviolence into a method of social resistance. In Gandhi's hands, Ahimsa became a powerful and universal method to combat oppression and injustice, but also interreligious violence and social evils, as I will elaborate. Gandhi struggled, for a good part of his life to name this movement. What should I call this method of resistance? So he first called his method passive resistance, but as it may be apparent to you, he was dissatisfied with this for various reasons. It was, first of all, it was a foreign name. It wouldn't move the masses in India as he wished to do. And as he said repeatedly, there's nothing passive about me, or there's nothing passive about my action. So in fact, he invited suggestions from readers of his journal. His journal was the Indian Opinion. So he publicly invited contributions for names for this movement. And one of his relatives, Maganlal Gandhi, suggested not Satyagraha, but Satyagraha. Satyagraha means firmness in a good cause, firmness in a truthful cause. And this is what Gandhi, let me just quote a paragraph from Gandhi. I liked the word. He's speaking here about Satyagraha, but it did not fully represent the whole idea I wished it to connote. I therefore corrected it to Satyagraha. Truth, or Satya, implies love, and Agraha, firmness, and therefore serves as Agraha is a synonym for force. I thus began to call the Indian movement Satyagraha. That is to say, the force which is born out of truth and love or non-violence. And I gave up the use of the phrase passive resistance in connection with it. This then was the genesis of the movement which came to be known as Satyagraha, and of the word used to designate it. So as you can see, Satyagraha brought truth and love and resistance together for the first time. Agraha meaning standing firm, resisting. And as Gandhi says, Satya is truth, but it also includes love. Now, let us spend a few minutes just exploring what was his justification for this method. How did he argue about the necessity for this method of resistance by truth and love? Here are a few points. Gandhi, different people had different beliefs about truth. You know, I mentioned before the influence of the Jain tradition on Gandhi. In the Jain tradition, one of the central teachings is, it's a long Sanskrit name, but I'll explain it, is Anekanta Vada. Anekanta Vada. Anek means many, and Vada is a doctrine. The doctrine of the manyness of reality, or the many ways of seeing reality. And I think this was a very important influence on Gandhi. So he was always conscious of the fact that people have very different beliefs about truth. What appears to be truth to one will not be truth to another. And one should not force another one to hold a view contrary to his or her beliefs. So when people have such different views, and especially when these views are in conflict with each other, how could they resolve these differences? How could they together search for truth? So for Gandhi, morality, or a moral human being, must resist when an opponent refuses to engage, or when an opponent acts contrary to an agreed path forward or an agreed decision. But the method of resistance, the method of struggling for any particular end, was not external but integral to it. One of the central pillars of Gandhi's philosophical thinking is that there's no gap between the means and the end. You know, you cannot achieve peace by violent means. Means and the ends are just like two sides of the coin. They're not separate. So if you're fighting for truth, then you have to fight by truthful means, by a truthful method, or the result will not be a truthful one. And that truthful method for him was Satyagraha. So Satyagrahism is the method in Sanskrit. The one who employs this method is called a Satyagrahi. Satyagrahi is the person who practices Satyagraha. So a Satyagrahi insists on truth as he or she sees it, but acknowledges that he may be wrong or only partially right, and therefore invites the opponent to join with him or her in a cooperative search for truth. When the invitation is declined, the Satyagrahi insists on truth in a truthful manner until the opponent is ready to talk about it. For Gandhi, rational discussion and persuasion were the best ways to deal with situations of conflict, to resolve conflict, reason. But since each individual was uniquely constituted, his perception of truth, as I said, differed. The point of rational discussion was to step into the other's shoe, to see the force of his or her argument, and to arrive at a view based on insights of both acceptable to both. So for him, there were three important assumptions about engaging in rational discussions. One is all participants should acknowledge that no one is in possession of the whole truth. Each one, therefore, should enter the discussion in a spirit of humility with an open mind. Secondly, so humility, I would say, is the first requisite. Secondly, since each one saw truth differently, each one should make an effort to enter into the other's world of thought, to step into the other's shoe, to see the other's perspective as the other sees it. Then maybe there will be disagreement, but one should make a sincere effort to see the other's point of view by entering into the other's worldview. And in other words, empathy. So humility, empathy. And thirdly, rational discussion was of no use if the other was selfish, ill-disposed, or full of hate. Such dispositions of the heart blocked understanding. So you required not only an open mind, humility and empathy, but you also required an open heart, as he put it. I think this is an important insight of Gandhi, that freedom from hate, the opening of the heart in empathy and love, is a precondition for rationality. And you will see the significance of that in a moment. So if and when, let us say, these three conditions of rationality are met, and what are those three conditions? Humility, acknowledging the limits of one's knowledge; empathy, a willingness to step into the other's shoe; and freedom from ill will, it is likely that a rational discussion has a good chance of resolving differences, or at the very least, reducing hostility. But he was realistic to know that these conditions are not often obtained in practice. In practice, you don't have humility, but you have arrogance and self-righteousness. You don't have empathy, you have self-centeredness, self-interest. You don't always have love for the other, but there is hate. So in South Africa, I think he experienced the limits of reason in resolving differences, because the conditions that he felt necessary for reason were absent. An appeal to reason is very difficult for those who are steeped in self-interest and even prejudice. Reason has its limits. So he felt that attributing omnipotence to reason was a form of idolatry. So he argued that the limitations of reason had pushed some people to see violence as an alternative to resolving conflicts. Because they experienced the limits of reason, they thought there was this binary way. It's either reason or violence. When reason fails, then for many people in history, the alternative was Ahimsa or violence. But Gandhi, this is where he proposed his method of Satyagraha as an alternative to when reason fails because the conditions are absent, then the alternative is not violence, but in his view, it's Satyagraha. And if we look at his writings, I would say that there are 4 reasons. I mean, he doesn't organize his reasoning in this way in which I am presenting it, but I think we could extract from his writings and his lectures at least 4 important arguments for Ahimsa and Satyagraha, where they are one and the same. The first is, and I mean, each one is a constellation of arguments. So the first would be the ontological arguments, which basically is that violence is based on an untruth. So remember, his method is Satyagraha, firmness in truth. Violence is based on an untruth. And what is that untruth? It denies the fundamental fact for Gandhi that all human beings constitute one community, and as a consequence of which love and goodwill, not hate and ill will, ought to be the valid basis for human relationships. Violence thrives on not on the unity of a human community, but on its division, its disunity. One of the things about Gandhi, I think that is undeniable, and this is perhaps something that we need to learn so much, that even in the midst of the strongest disagreements, I don't think you would ever find an example of where he sought to win support for his case by demonizing his opponent. He understood clearly that when a conflict may be inevitable, but when a conflict is constructed sharply in terms of we and they, victory and defeat, then the doors to reconciliation are narrowed or they are shut, and a transformed community becomes very difficult. So one is left with an enemy, a defeated enemy perhaps, but the conflict is only postponed. The conflict will be reignited. So he included his opponent in what I would call the circle of his identity. The opponent was not outside of his empathy, outside of the circle of his identity, but included in it. In South Africa, Gandhi was imprisoned several times for his protests. And when in prison, he opted to learn leatherwork and made sandals. When leaving South Africa, he handed over a pair of sandals to his secretary, Sonia Shelsin, and asked that she deliver them to General Smuts, the man who sent him to prison as a gift. And Smuts wore these sandals every summer at his farm near Pretoria. When Gandhi turned 70, General Smuts returned the sandals back to him as a gesture of friendship. And in a memorial volume to Gandhi, Smuts wrote, and I quote, "It was my fate to be the antagonist of a man for whom even I had the highest respect. He never forgot the human background of the situation, never lost his temper, or succumbed to hate." It's a remarkable statement from one of his earliest and most significant adversaries in life. But I think, this is a character of Gandhi, and never lost that ontological vision of human unity, that common humanity that we share, even when we are engaged in deep disputes with others. The second set of arguments I would name as epistemological. I mentioned it before. So these are all arguments for Ahimsa. According to Gandhi, it goes back to the Jain viewpoint, all knowledge is limited, fallible, subject to correction. We are all formed by our histories, our contexts, our distinctive experiences. We see truth differently. Violence, he argued, is a denial of this basic epistemological fact, because it generally assumes that one is absolutely right and the other is absolutely wrong. It does not leave room for or acknowledge fallibility, leave room for learning and reconsideration. Satyagraha aims to help parties in conflict to understand each other. So this is the source of an understanding of human epistemological limits is for him one of the grounds for non-violence and not violence, because sometimes if we act on the basis of infallibility and the consequences of violence are sometimes can't be called back. They can't be undone. The third would be moral arguments. Basically, for Gandhi, morality consists in doing what is right because you believe it to be right. Violence, he argued, does not change the opponent's perception of truth. It is an attempt to compel an opponent to behave in a manner contrary to his sincerely held beliefs. And so therefore it postpones the conflict. The person is not transformed. Violence doesn't transform an opponent, or violence does not bring about a sincere change in the moral position of an opponent, and therefore the conflict is not resolved, it is simply postponed. Non-violence, Ahimsa, Satyagraha, seeks, according to Gandhi, to persuade, to reach both the heart and the mind of their adversary, to to have a genuine transformation of viewpoint. And the fourth I would name as a teleological argument. Gandhi, argued again and again that violence does not achieve lasting results. So judged in terms of long-term effects and the kind of society it created, violence is not helpful. Every time we use violence, it encourages the belief that violence is the only effective way to achieve a desirable goal, and therefore it increases the habit of using it again. It blunts our moral sensibility. It creates a vicious cycle. It's very transient. The results are very transient. Peace that comes from violence is not transformative, enduring peace. So Satyagraha, I think it's fair to say, was a method aimed more at the transformation of the heart, to awaken our sense of humanity, to activate our deep moral impulses. It relies on suffering love. Confronted with injustice, a Satyagrahi uses initially the method of reason and dialogue. So when this fails, the Satyagrahi does not opt for violence, but for non-violence, to resist through love. He did everything to put his opponent at ease, doesn't harass, embarrass, anger, or frighten him, but is willing to receive the hate and the violence of the opponent. I'm sure we'll have different views on this. It's a controversial point, but he had a firm faith and in the power of love to transform, suffering love. And I think he looked to Jesus. He spoke of Jesus as a Satyagrahi. He saw Jesus's death on the cross as probably the greatest example in human history of Satyagraha, of suffering love. And Jesus was a great inspiration for him. Each Satyagraha passed through 3 stages before it was launched. So it was a method that he developed. It had a structure to it. You simply can't. One had to train oneself to be a Satyagrahi. Non-violence required the practice of non-violence. You can't simply pull people from the streets in a non-violent act of resistance, because people have to be trained. It's a moral transformation. So he developed a method for it. So you have to start with a reasoned defense of your objectives, to call for negotiation, to call for discussion, to call for reasoning. Channels of communication must be kept open, and only those with the highest moral character could participate, because it requires a willingness to accept the violence of the other. Why does suffering love work? These are not necessarily all of Gandhi's arguments. Some of them are. Is it difficult for a human being to continue to inflict suffering in another? especially when the victim offers no resistance. This is what Gandhi hoped. Because the Satyagrahi is behaving contrary to general expectations, which is that one would react with violence to violence. He also believed, as I said, in the spiritual power of love, that love was something, it was an energy, it is a force. It was powerful, a silent, unseen force that had the, if one truly exemplified it, he felt it had the capacity, the power to touch the innermost spiritual center of the other, to break through the barriers of ill will. It could loosen and release the hate of the opponent and awaken in him a sense of decency. Again, some would disagree with that. I know my time is going, and I want to leave a few minutes for a discussion. But let me just. There's so much, Gandhi is such a complex, such a rich figure in history. There's so much to be said about him. But I want to just make two further points about his understanding of Satyagraha and Ahimsa. Gandhi's belief that violence cannot be overcome by violence, that is well known, and we are talking about that. What is less known but equally important for Gandhi was the violence exercised by the state. State violence was something that concerned him a great deal. And so in 1935 he wrote, "The state represents violence in a concentrated and organized form. The individual has a soul, but the state is a soulless machine, which can never be weaned from violence to which it owes its very existence." Of course, we have to keep in mind that Gandhi, both in South Africa and in India, experienced the violence of the state, but he felt that the state often provided a mask behind which the human propensity for violence was enhanced. And I mention that because I want you to see that in our discussion of nonviolence and the legacy of Gandhi, the emphasis often still remains on individual human beings and on interpersonal violence. But the violence of the state was a real concern for Gandhi. And of course, states continue to be among the most significant perpetrators of violence in our own time. The second point I want to make and lift up here is Gandhi's understanding of the relationship between Satyagraha, Ahimsa, and social justice. And in 1940, Gandhi wrote, and I quote, "The first condition of nonviolence is justice, all around in every department of life. Perhaps it is too much to expect of human nature. I do not, however, think so. No one should dogmatize about the capacity of human nature for degradation or exaltation." In the same year, he wrote, "No human being could be actively nonviolent and not rise against social injustice, no matter where it occurred." So this clear understanding between the practice of nonviolence and the resistance of injustice. No one could be actively nonviolent and not rise against social injustice. And I think that phrase, actively nonviolent, is particularly revealing. He obviously saw what he considered to be a lot of inactive nonviolence. For him, nonviolence was a form of action, even though the word ahimsa might come across as negative. So his understanding of social injustice was very expansive. He said at one time, poverty is the worst form of violence. He was not naive about oppressive social structures, poverty, colonialism, and so on. So my last word is that, you know, the goal of Satyagraha and Ahimsa for Gandhi is not just the overcome of violence, but it is the creation of community. I think in this sense, you know, very similar to Dr. King. Dr. King spoke of his community as the beloved community. Gandhi called it the kingdom of God. For him, he used the word Ram, so he spoke of Ram Rajya, an inclusive community of reconciliation and justice, a community hospitable to diversity, a community that included the poor, the untouchables, persons from all of India's diverse religious traditions, Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, Jews. He visualized a true human community in which people of diverse faiths may come to have the same regard for each other as they have for members of their own traditions. We would all be defenders and protectors of each other's rights, ready to speak out and to protest when others are defamed, misrepresented, betrayed, or treated unjustly. So I think, Professor Chris, I have spoken a little too long, so I will stop here, and I will listen eagerly to questions and comments. You know, not necessarily a question, but I would love to hear what can we learn.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anand, Dr. Rambachan, for your wonderful talk on Gandhi. And I think you touched so many wonderful points in such a short period of time. We could hear you for an eternity, but since we are limited to time and space, let's open the floor for discussion. And if you don't mind, I will throw maybe one question or comment to you in regards to Gandhi. In terms of philosophy of Ahimsa and Satyagraha. The word Satyagraha also comes from Sanskrit, from Sat, which sometimes translated as being in terms of existence. So how do you think he, in a way, integrated being with the search for truth, the quest for truth, and why this is important ontologically, epistemologically, metaphysically, or spiritually speaking? Why being is part of the whole equation here?
It's a very good observation, very good question, Chris. So Satya, or Sat in short, as you quite rightly said, can also be translated as truth, or even truth speaking. You know, it's called Satya. There are so many passages in the sacred text that speak of Satya as truth and truth telling, but at a more fundamental ontological level, as you're saying, Satya means being. Ultimate reality is called Sat. So you'd find in the Vedas, in the Upanishads, many texts would say that in the beginning, you know, before anything came into existence, what was there was Sat. Sat existed. That ultimate reality, that infinite, inexhaustible reality. And I think the connection here that I would see is that for Gandhi, our human relationships find their ground and find their justification in the nature of that ultimate reality. That is what justifies or provides the basis for our own human relationships in this world. Gandhi, you know, he drew deeply from all of the Hindu traditions, and also from traditions that were not Hindu, as I already said, Jesus was a figure of great inspiration for him. One of his closest comrades was Jewish. He had Muslims who lived in his ashram. When he gathered every evening, for prayer. In fact, he was assassinated while he was going to a prayer meeting. He was unique in that sense. He would have people read from the Bible. He'll have people read from the Quran. He will have people read from the Gita. Maybe, Chris, he was one of the earliest in history to invite people to participate in this interfaith learning and interfaith worship. But as far as the Hindu tradition is concerned, he described himself as a non-dualist, which is a Dvaita. That was the tradition that appealed to him basically because of his vision of the unity of all existence. The unity of all existence, that this one infinite being is present equally in everything, and everything is in it. So that vision of ontological unity is the source of his nonviolence. Therefore, because we are one, we have one source, and that one source is present equally in everything. We are united through that one source, and therefore our relationship should not be relationships of hate and ill will, but of love and compassion and generosity to each other. So ontology is the source of his ethics, and I think that's why I would say he connects Satya as being and Satya as truth.
And I think Dr. I think it's Varayana. Vasudha, are you there? Because I think you were raising your hand. Please.
Yes. Yes, I am.
Hello, Vasudha.
Thank you.
Good to see
Hi,
you.
Anand. Hi.
What a pleasant surprise that you gave time to attend my lecture.
Thanks for the generosity of your host. Thank you. I apologize for a question. And first of all, I apologize for the noise. I'm not used to Teams. So when I joined, I didn't know how to mute myself. I have a question on Gandhi's Ahimsa. And it's kind of propitious that you spoke so much about it today. My colleague and I were pondering on a particular passage that Gandhi wrote, in which he says, and I quote, "A man is just as useful as a cow, no matter whether he be a Mohammedan or a Hindu. Am I then to fight with or kill a Mohammedan in order to save a cow? In doing so, I'd become the enemy of the Mohammedan as well as the cow. If I were overfilled of pity for the cow, I should sacrifice myself, my life to save her, but not take my brother." We found this passage a little confusing as to why he would kill himself. We didn't understand. It's not because of animal rights? Why would he kill himself to save that cow? He wrote this in Hindu Swaraj, in Swaraj.
Yes. As you read that passage, Vasudaji, I'm thinking so much of some contemporary issues on the Indian subcontinent as relationships between Hindus and Muslims and matters relating to the cow. Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting passage. I haven't seen that passage before, so my answer can only be very, very general, which I would think that he seems to be saying, or I'll have to ponder it a little more, but I'm hearing him saying that in general, I would give my life before taking the life of another. Even though it might be, in this case, he's using the example of the cow, but I think I'm discerning here that general principle of self-sacrifice before harm to another. But maybe you might have an insight, more than that.
Not I, but I'll send you the passage, and I'd be very appreciative if you had further thoughts. But it sounds almost like a Jane in trying
Yes.
to kill
Yes.
yourself before you
Yes.
hurt
Yes.
anyone else.
And we talked a little bit about that, Vasudha, the deep influence of the Jain tradition on Gandhi is not often highlighted. I think a lot of his ascetic practices are very, very could be traced to Jain. So, for example, his use of the fast, as a method of resistance. It's very, very interesting, and several times he brought himself on the verge of death when he could find no other method of stopping the madness of violence. And this maybe relate to what your passage. He put his life on the line. In other words, if you will pay attention to what you are doing to each other, if my death will awaken you to the brutality of your treatment of each other, then I'm going to put my life on the line. And when violence broke out in Bengal between Hindus and Muslims, and no one could stop it, this is what he did, and everyone says it worked. I know it depended a lot on his moral stature, but putting his life on line in that way and willingness to die, there's no doubt about that, did work. But thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, Steve, you were raising also your hand. Please go ahead.
Dr. Rambachan, I know that Gandhi seemed to have a great respect for the power of the small act. I like there was a quote of him saying about the act of service of one heart, something like this, is better than 10,000 heads bowed in prayer. And I thought that, I was thinking of that when you mentioned the firmness in a good cause. I've not heard that phrase before. And I know how groups of people tend to find comfort in themselves because we're sort of herd animals. But when one person will stand up for something that's right, and you know that person is standing up for the thing that's right, it's easier to stand up with them when you've seen it and be with them than to be the first one to stand up against them. And so you were talking about the ontological violence is based on untruth. Division, I think, divisiveness is something that seems to be growing rather than shrinking. I think it may be one of the most crucial points we have going politically in the world right now. So if anybody runs across one of those famous Gandhi quotes that helps people deal with divisiveness and division and overcoming that, I would like to hear that. I'm big with little quotes that I keep around and think about. Stay on the right track.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Chris. He couldn't necessarily do it on a large scale, but in South Africa, and then when he returned to India, he experimented with these. Traditionally, let me step back a bit. Traditionally, an ashram was a place, a sort of a monastic institution where a guru, a teacher, lived with students. This is part of the creativity, I think, of Mahatma Gandhi, that he used this idea of the ashram, which is a intentional community, but to create in a microcosm at least a version of what a diverse society could be like. As I said, he brought together in these small communities people of different religious traditions, including the untouchables of India, people of Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Jains, men, women. He brought together all of India's diversity to live together in these experimental communities, where, as you were saying, Chris, there was a he was able to achieve a certain unity in these communities, and was hoping that these communities can be models for what a nation could look like. So intentional ashram communities, I think, is part of his legacy.
He was quite a figure. I had heard about his watch and sandals. I wasn't aware of the other three possessions. But I wonder how many famous people right now, or people in power right now, would have such a small, paltry, everybody wants to enrich and glorify themselves. What an unusual and different thing. Your three preconditions to humility and other person's perspective.
That's so true.
In mind, so, thank you for being with us. I really enjoyed this. I needed it.
Thank you for inviting me, Steve. I appreciate it.
So any more questions, comments from participants? And by the way, thank you to all of you for joining this wonderful late afternoon, evening, depending where you are. Some people are joining us also from I think the East Coast, and we have a doctor from Atlanta. So we have people from all walks of life today, not only students and professors, but the staff members and administrators. The chair of my department just left a few minutes ago, but he wanted to be at least present today. So any other questions, comments from anyone? Yes, please go ahead, Ian.
So my question would be, do you have any techniques or anything that would help us apply these teachings into our everyday lives? Like, what could we do to apply these teachings to how we go about communicating with others?
It's a very good question that I think it's good for all of us to reflect on, Ian. I think that sadly we live in a culture of violence in so many ways, structural violence, interpersonal violence. Whatever his, as I started my lecture talking about, his feelings as a human being, whatever his feelings, he called us to a higher ideal of nonviolence, which he felt, as I said in response to Professor Chris's question, reflect the deepest nature of reality. If we understood, the divine one, we would be transformed into beings of love and generosity and compassion for each other. And so I think we need, Ian, we teach the ways of violence. We need to teach the ways of nonviolence. And I mean, as Dr. King kept emphasizing to us also, we need to teach the ways of nonviolence. And we have to start in some small way. And perhaps, Ian, there is no better way to start but in our homes. And to start with nonviolent child nurturing practices. Nonviolent nurturing spirituality in our homes. In so many ways, in our child rearing practices in homes or in our schools and communities, we still condone violence in so many of its manifestation. So to become conscious of the ways in which we still express violence in word and in action, and at the time when a child's sense of self is at its most fragile, to nurture children in nonviolent ways, ways that are filled with love. I think that it's in answer to your question. It's a place to start. Maybe we need to educate in nonviolent ways, and We need perhaps courses, Professor Chris, in nonviolence in our institutions of education.
Yeah, I think King was raising the hand, and then Dr. Jones. You will be next, Sandy. So yeah, Kim, go ahead, please.
Yes, hi. I wanted to clarify something that I thought you had said. So this idea of non-injury, even though you said that it was an idea of Jainism, this word or this concept, is it written in the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads? Is that idea written in
Yes.
the sacred texts?
Yes, yes, it
Okay.
is. It is. It is.
Okay.
It have
So a parallel that go ahead.
No, please go ahead. Yes, it is. So yes, the answer is yes.
Well, I'm just starting to study more in depth some of the Hindu traditions. But one thing that I notice is, being that that word specifically comes from the Hindu sacred texts, Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. both seem to have taken like a, like a hermeneutics or exegesis from their texts of really the idea of love, a universal and ancient concept, really.
Yeah.
And through their hermeneutics and their exegesis of that, through their understanding and their revelation of that, they really changed time, they changed history, and they brought something that was an ancient idea forward, something for us to learn from that really is not, it's not a new idea.
No.
This is something that has been since humanity.
Yes. Yes. It is right. I agree with you fully. You know, we have texts in the Vedas, Himsam, Na Kuryat, do not injure, do not hurt. You know, so take for example, you know, how yoga has become very popular as a practice in outside of India today. But in fact, the classical yoga text, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, he actually begins with ethics. And the first ethical principle that he enunciates is ahimsa. In his view, the practice of yoga requires non-violence, ahimsa. In his list, Bhagavad Gita also, again, ahimsa is a cardinal ethical value. So yes, I agree with you fully. And it's ancient, and you know, we are challenged, Kim, to continue working on what it means for us. How we can, as Ian asked in his question, how can we use this beautiful ancient teaching to transform our lives and our communities in our present context? How can we overcome violence with non-violence, wherever that violence is present? So I thank you for that comment, Kim. I agree with you.
Yeah, please, Sandy, go ahead.
Well, it's kind of a comment and a question. When you were talking outside of violence, I just kept thinking of the polarization of the United States government right now and these idiotic inabilities to communicate with each other. And when you said, you know, the way to do it is to get into, or one way to do it is to get into the mind of your opponent and understand them better. And I just kept thinking, boy, I wish we could send you and make the Senate and the House of Representatives in the U.S. take a compulsory class with you, because if you could teach those people, to operate in different ways, it's ridiculous the way they behave, and it's so destructive to any progress. And anyway, I really enjoyed your talk, and you just made me think about that. Sorry.
Thank you for that, Leslie, because I think you're so right. And I mean, just going back to Gandhi, you know, what we are seeing today in our own society here is not simply disagreement, but ill will, hate. You know, disagreement itself is less problematic, but when it is combined with the demonizing of the other, the denigration of the other, when it lacks empathy, lacks humility, then it becomes very destructive. And I think that's what is happening. That's what's happening to us politically, and it's a great tragedy. So I thank you for that comment, Leslie. Thank you.
So yeah, we are almost at the end of our talk, but if anyone has one more question, comment, you are more than welcome. I know Jose Andújar is a Merton friend. I'm pretty sure he also have comments, and Joe Newton is one of our former students from VSU, from our department, but he's working now in IT on technology. So if anyone has any comment, questions, please feel free to raise your hands, and you're more than welcome to share your thoughts. Anyone else?
I will follow up a little bit on the last comment. I think the empathy that you mentioned about the free preconditions, other person's perspective, I think that's a major problem that we have today, in that people thinking about what other people are thinking is a very bad way to go down the road. That assuming a bad thing about this other person makes me hate this other person. I see that everywhere, all day long. People that feel closer to their own group talk badly about the other group. They think about what that other bad thing that other person is thinking about to justify your own ill will toward that person. And that takes you away from the third condition about being free of ill will. But that's that divisiveness thing. Yes. I've got to find a good Gandhi quote that will keep me from having that on my mind. So maybe somebody out there will run across one and let me know.
Yeah, thank you for that, Steve.
I have one quick question in regards to the concept of truth and Gandhi, especially in the context of South Africa. And since he had many friends who were British and who were members also of the Theosophical Society, is there any connection between the Gandhi, the search for truth and quest for truth, and the possible influences that he had in those years when he had friends that belong, they were members of the Theosophical Society at all? Or is simply just he came up with a Hindu Jain perspective with no influence whatsoever from the theosophical connection with some of his British friends?
Chris, he was very young when he went to study law in England, and his own development as a Hindu in India came largely in his family, his mother's practices, his father's practices, but he had not really studied Hindu texts on his own. So in fact, he says when he went to England, this was the first time that he read the Bhagavad Gita, because, as you said, he rediscovered his tradition in a new way because of the interest of the Theosophical Society. He was looking for a place where he could go, and he used to attend those meetings, and they were discussing Hindu texts. So that was the first time he read the translation of the Bhagavad Gita by Edwin Arnold, and also he read the New Testament, the Gospels, which, as he said, when I read it, the Sermon on the Mount went straight to my heart. That's how he put it. It went straight to my heart, and that's a good place to end. Chris, I think one of the things that we can learn from him today is that humility that enables us to open our hearts and minds to learning from diverse traditions. He was outstanding in that regard. He was not afraid to admit and to confess what he had learned from other traditions and from practitioners of other religious traditions. He exemplified that epistemological humility, I would say, that enabled him to be a student of all of the great teachers in our world. Maybe we can all, embody that kind of attitude.
Thank you very much. And Joe Newton wrote down a question for you, which relates to this conversation. It was, who were Gandhi's mentors and heroes? And by the way, he did some research and he found that your name translates as a speech of God.
Yes, it does. Thank you. That's true. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rambachan, for this wonderful time. And I know that you are also busy and doing many things, and you were so grateful to be and so kind to take the time to meet with us and with our club and with members from not only VSU, but also from people who came to us from many different places. So I hope that all of you have enjoyed this wonderful club event. In March, actually, we are expecting, we just got confirmation from Dr. Joe Holland, who is a Catholic intellectual, talking about ecological spirituality. I also got confirmation today that in one of my classes, I'm going to have also a Protestant evangelical Christian, Gransberg, Wes Gransberg is going to be with us in March on the same day that Joe Holland is talking through our club. And then your friend and aunt, Rita.
Oh, yes. Wonderful.
She's going to be also in one of my classes, and I will send emails to people who are interested in the topic. So you will be able to get links and open, you can go through via Teams and enter into these conversations at any time when we make it them public. But thank you for everything. Namaste.
Namaste.
And peace in the world, and hopefully Russia and the rest of the world will be able to join forces through dialogue, and we can avoid and prevent this nonsense, which is creating a lot of tension and conflicts right now around the globe, not only in Ukraine, but around the globe.
Thank you for inviting me, Professor Chris. What a pleasure to spend this time with all of you. Thank you for your comments, for your questions. I really enjoyed my time with you, and wish all of you well, be safe. And as Professor Chris said, let's hope there is peace in Europe. Bye, everyone.